When it comes to the history of the last 120 years, I believe there's no country like Turkey that if you just study it, you can get a glimpse of what has happened in the world in the last 120 years. So let's have a quick recap in 5 minutes. Turkey entered the 20th century, of course, as the Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic space. In 1908, it saw a liberal revolution that was part of a wave of liberal revolutions that happened also in other places like Iran, Russia, China, and different developments in Japan that had some similarities. The question of trying to catch up with the West that had occupied many of the 19th century will become an important element for Turkey as for much of the world in different ways. The First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was part of the collapse of grand empires like Germany, Russia, and Austro-Hungary, also meant the rise of national polities. Now, Vladimir Putin once said that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, geopolitically speaking, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd argue the bigger catastrophe happened earlier in the century and by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This is because of the particular way that it collapsed, the way that it led to the Arabs coming under European colonial control, and the Republic of Turkey itself replacing one of the only countries in the non-European world that had not been colonized with a sort of a radically ethnocentric republic that came with many problems. Of course, the genocide of Armenians and Assyrians had started before the formation of the republic, but different sort of ethnic cleansing in the Anatolia and different sorts of political subjugation of people who were considered to be non-Turks became definitive elements of this Republic of Turkey. Of course, these are negative elements. There were also many positive elements. Foundation of a secular republic, the emphasis on the rights of women, and formation of a sovereign republic that would lead ultimately in 1950 to multi-party elections and a democratic process in Turkey. I sidestep over the Second World War. I don't have much time for it, and I'll make an argument that while Second World War was, of course, seminally important, but if you look at countries that were neutral in the war, we'll get something without centering the war so much. After the war, Turkey, in the last days of the war, it had declared a symbolic war on Germany and Japan, and it joined the United Nations. The heavy-handed approach of the Soviet Union meant that it quickly had to take the side of the West in the Cold War, and it played a role in the Korean War. In the post-war period, from 50 to 91 to the end of Habsburg, a short 20th century, Turkey saw mass communist movement, 4 coups which had different orientation. The 1960 coup was more of a left-wing orientation, whereas the one in the 1980 was very much anti-communist and aimed at putting an end to the challenge that the communists had raised in Turkish society. In the 80s and later on in the 90s, like many countries in the world, it saw a rise of neoliberalism. And what it has seen in the days since, in the last 30 or 40 years, if you want to look at broad sweeps, is that, so we have neoliberalism, but we also see that things that Ataturk and the founders of the modern Turkish Republic had thought very easily they can get rid of, like Islamism or a rise of an Islamic-based national identity, make a comeback, of course. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a president who is now known as much for his authoritarianism as for his pro-conservative economic views, and also Islamism and the way he has sort of valorized a essentialized Islamic identity for Turkey and used it in the war that he has often waged with the Kurdish minority in the country, as much as the fight that he's had with women's rights activists or people he considers seculars in his own country. We look at this broad swath of Turkish history in the last 120 years, I think it becomes very clear that it is the ideal country to study to understand what's going on. Tanpınar, the great novelist of the Turkish 20th century, liked to talk of the horrible thing called belatedness, and that was central to understanding Turkish history. I think it is important in understanding the history of the last 120 years to look at it from the perspective of countries like Turkey, who had to play in a game whose rules had been set already by different players, basically the Europeans and the West, and how they went through this and answered this challenge. And they, of course, being different classes in Turkey, different political movements, but also those who got to rule the country at each different points.